Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar on clinical trials. My name is Pat Sullivan. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of the HeartBrothers. The HeartBrothers, just a little bit about us. The HeartBrothers was founded in 2014 by myself and another transplant patient and their spouses. We are a 501c3 nonprofit foundation dedicated to helping from early stage patients all the way through post-transplant. Next slide. Our sole mission is to support heart failure patients and their loved ones navigate a life with heart failure and all of its challenges. At this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Joy Donohue. Joy comes to us she's the Vice President of Marketing at C2 Sense, and they make laboratory diagnostics equipment for everyone. And she's been a great supporter of the HeartBrothers when we met her 4 or 5 years ago. And she's a great moderator, a dear friend. It's Joy Donohue. Take it over, Joy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat. Hello, everybody. My name is Joy Donohue. It's been a minute since I've moderated a webinar, so feel free to laugh with me as I go along. Next slide, please. Many of you have been a part of the HeartBrothers Foundation community for years now, and we're so pleased that you've joined us this evening, and thank you so much for being here. For those of you who are new friends, we welcome you, invite you to check out the HeartBrothers website at heartbrothers.org, where you can find wonderful resources, on financial assistance, short-term housing, patient support groups, and other helpful links. Next slide, please. In addition to these resources, you'll find information about assistance and tools for long-term hospitalization, peer-to-peer support, and the HeartBrothers House, a short-term housing solution backed by the foundation. Next slide, please. Lastly, the foundation hosts wonderful programs like a virtual patient support group, their heart failure blog, and organ donation awareness. Next, please. This is our disclaimer. So while today's participating medical professionals are licensed and qualified to practice medicine, you should seek the advice of your own physician or medical support person with any questions that you may have regarding your specific condition. The information shared today is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice from your own healthcare provider. And next, we're just going to do a couple quick best practices. For higher quality viewing, choose full screen in the upper right-hand corner. To make comments, please use the chat in the bottom navigation, then select all panelists and attendees from the dropdown. To ask questions, please use the Q&A in the bottom navigation. So now, next slide, please, is the fun part, actually. It's the introduction. I get to say, now for the reason that you're actually here with us this evening. We're so excited that you could be here tonight for the webinar about the benefits of clinical trials. Since I started working in medical device about 10 years ago, I really gained a tremendous appreciation of how important clinical trials are to bringing new technologies and medicines to patients. However, without the hospitals, the wonderful medical professionals, and willing patients, that progress would be impossible. But speaking of wonderful medical professionals, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Amanda Vest present to us this evening. Dr. Vest received training, at the Imperial College in London, Boston University Medical Center, and Cleveland Clinic, Ohio, to become a heart failure and transplant cardiologist. She sees mostly patients with advanced heart failure, medical circulatory support, and transplantation, as well as patients with sarcoidosis and other cardiomyopathies. She's a diplomat of the American Board of Obesity Medicine and medically treats obesity for patients with heart failure. She serves as the Director of Advanced Heart Failure and is the Medical Director of Cardiac Transplantation at Tufts Medical Center and co-directs the Clinical Nutrition course at Tufts University School of Medicine. Dr. Vest has extensive experience over the past 10 years in clinical research and has clinical trial funded by the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health. So if you'd be so kind, Dr. Vest, I'd love to hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Joy. That's an incredibly kind introduction. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Pat and the HeartBrothers for the kind invitation today. And as you heard, I'm going to present a little on what is clinical research and give you some of the background about why we do clinical trials, what sort of clinical trials are going on, and what it may mean for you to consider participation in a clinical research study. I'd be very happy to take any questions either as we go through, or I know there's some time for Q&A at the end. Now, you may have taken part in a clinical trial, you may have heard about clinical trials, or not really have been exposed to them during your healthcare journey. When you do hear about a clinical trial or a research project, you may be wondering, is it the right thing to take part or not? Is it going to be safe to participate? Or you may not have come across one and want to know if there's a study that you could join yourself. So today I'm going to address what is clinical research and touch a little on why is it important within healthcare and specifically within treatments for heart failure, including cardiac transplantation. What should participants expect if they do agree to get involved in a trial? And how might you find out about research that's going on in your area? All the way through, I hope I express my gratitude towards participants in clinical trials, because of course, without the participants and their caregivers being willing to give of time and get involved, so many of the advances that we have across medicine and surgery simply would not be possible. So research in this setting means medical or health research, which is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute towards generalizable knowledge. So this means that whatever the knowledge is that's derived from a study or a project is going to become available to apply to other patients or other scenarios outside of just those individuals who were studied in the project. And this is important because the definition of clinical research and the development of generalizable knowledge is part of what goes into determining if a project is going to need to pass all the regulatory thresholds and all the patient protections that are appropriate when it's a study about people and their health. There are lots of ways that investigators and scientists can go about developing generalizable knowledge that takes us further forward in understanding a condition, understanding its diagnostic tools, or understanding its treatments. Some research is called basic research or preclinical research. This type of research uses either cells or sometimes animal models to conduct its testing. There would be questions asked that would be at a very kind of cellular, scientific level about how does a receptor work or what does this molecule do? And those sort of studies tend to take place in a research lab. There may be elements related to patients that could be involved, such as tissue culture from patients, but this isn't really thought of as patient research in the way that we're going to talk about today. Clinical and population science research is the research where we're engaging patients or sometimes healthy volunteers in studies to understand conditions, diseases, treatments. And so the key here is that it involves people. Implementation research takes this knowledge learned one step further. And so here it's a translation of the findings of a clinical research study into practice. And so finding out, well, how does that new drug that we've shown works for this condition actually get rolled out in real life into real people's clinics, real people's pharmacies, and get used by the patient in the real world setting? So you can think of it as this clinical research in the middle, the basic research in the laboratory sort of informing it, and the implementation research being kind of the final cherry on the cake, as it were, of really understanding how is that treatment going to be used in the real world. But we'll be focusing in the middle here today. Now, the clinical research that I'm going to speak about can occur in lots of places. People often think of it happening in the hospital or maybe an outpatient clinic. Sometimes it can happen through home visits with the research team, perhaps going to the participant's location of residence. Sometimes, though, it even happens online and at the convenience of the patient. So we'll talk a little bit about some different ways in which research could be engaged in. There are also some different types of clinical research studies, and you may be familiar with some of these that you've participated in or heard about over the years. So one type of research is a registry or a biobank. So these mean settings where the investigators have a question that they want to ask about a condition or a clinical scenario, and they would like patients to participate in a registry where some data is collected, maybe information about people with this condition, what their symptoms are, what medicines they're on, what happens to them over time, results of scans, and so forth. In this study, there may be a need to ask the patient for permission to look in the medical records, or perhaps at lab findings and research and studies such as imaging to use in the research study. But the participant wouldn't be doing anything extra or anything different or special in their medical care, because it's just a registry, it's just collecting information. Sometimes the information that the researchers need to collect in order to answer their research question is blood or tissue samples. So you may be asked to participate in a biobanking study. So for example, many hospitals have biobanking around either a left ventricular assist device implantation surgery or a transplant surgery, where researchers again may ask permission, and for any of these activities, we need your informed consent and to ask your permission to collect a blood sample at the time of surgery, for example, or even to take a sample from the section of heart that is removed at the time of LVAD surgery, to place the LVAD and to biobank that, and then in future run tests in the laboratory to understand the heart muscle cells or how they respond to drugs. Some types of studies may involve a survey or a questionnaire. Like, for example, you may be approached about participating in a survey that maybe measures quality of life. People may be interested in your opinions about your treatment, or have a survey about what medications you've used in the past. These sort of studies often offer quite a bit of flexibility. So this is the type of scenario where they can potentially be completed in your home. Some of them are online, some of them are on paper. Some may be just a one-time survey asking your opinions or your experiences with something. Others may be a repeated survey. So for example, there have been some quality of life projects after people receive a left ventricular assist device, asking them similar questions before they get their VAD, 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, to understand how a patient's life changes on left ventricular assist device support. Another group of studies are called prospective observational studies. So here you may be invited to participate in a project where some of the activities are for research only, meaning they're not just part of your regular care and they're not something that ordinarily your doctors and nurses would be ordering, but it's an extra test or activity that's being funded by the research study to collect additional information about your health condition or something about your medical situation. However, importantly, in these observational studies, still it's just that your healthcare, your physiology is being observed, nothing's being changed. And so it's very important to be able to ask the person approaching you about research and to understand if this study is just observational, because all of these ones that I've described to you so far are observing things or asking things or taking additional pictures or labs, but they're not changing the treatment that you're having or the care direction. This is different in a randomized clinical trial. So when we talk about clinical trials, here we're talking about assigning participants who consent to the study between 2 or more different strategies. So the strategy could be a couple of different ways to diagnose a condition, like do you undergo this sort of testing or this other sort of testing? Or it could be a study of types of treatments. And I'll give some examples of what those types of treatments could be. But depending upon your participation in this trial and how you are randomly assigned between groups, that will affect the diagnostic strategy or the treatment strategy that you receive. So very important to understand if this is going to be a clinical trial where differences in treatment are being trialed versus these studies where we're just observing how you're doing with your standard medical care. Now, I mentioned there are lots of things that we can study in clinical trials, and these are some of the interventions that on their own or in combination could be looked at by a clinical trial. So it could be a new drug. As you can imagine, there are many new compounds that are in development, trying to solve the really thorny questions in medicine at this time, many of them related to cardiovascular health. And as I'll show in a moment, these drugs go through a very regulated and very methodical process of evaluating both, are they effective and are they safe? But once they've gotten to a point of development where the researchers and study sponsors think that this drug is ready to be tested for its efficacy, meaning how well it works, and its safety in humans, that drug would go into a clinical trial. And this is how we've been able to obtain so many good drugs for conditions like heart failure. The sacubitril valsartan, empagliflozin, dapagliflozin, spironolactone, eplerenone, all these sorts of medicines have come in through clinical trials in the last 10 to 20 years. And the reason why we know them to be helpful and appropriate for patients are because of the clinical trials that have resulted. There are also devices. Of course, things like left ventricular assist devices, as well as an implantable cardiac defibrillator or pacemaker devices, they all go through trials. So too do temporary support devices, like some of the temporary pumps that are used in the cardiac care unit for people who are critically ill. A type of intervention studied in a trial could be a surgery, maybe even comparing one way of doing a surgery against another way of doing a surgery. Sometimes also therapies like radiation need clinical trials. Diagnostic procedures sometimes need clinical trials. For example, there have been a number of clinical trials trying to understand how best to investigate coronary blockages and understand which patients may need a stent or a bypass to open up the coronaries. There are several different ways that we can approach that diagnostic question, with stress tests, with CT scans, and with angiograms. And there have been a number of trials that have put head-to-head different strategies of diagnostic testing to see which pathway ends up yielding the right result most of the time, and the best patient safety, as well as the best overall healthcare experience. And diet and lifestyle is obviously a very important part of clinical trials research. It can be super difficult to do dietary and lifestyle interventions. Some of these dietary and exercise studies are incredibly complex to set up, because one has to maintain a consistency across the clinical trial participants, and doing that when somebody is obviously at liberty to eat things that come their way can be incredibly difficult. But well-performed clinical trials are essential to our understanding of what lifestyle factors promote health, especially cardiovascular health. Now, I mentioned there are phases of trials. So even before a new drug, for example, gets out to a randomized clinical trial, which is a big clinical trial establishing the effectiveness of the medication, and often called a phase 3 trial, there will have been a lot of work, often for many, many years preceding it. So those preclinical trials in the lab, maybe working on cell cultures, testing a new molecule, are often the starting point of a new drug. Phase 1 trials are usually very small and test the safety and side effects of a new treatment, usually in individuals who are healthy. So often these are young adults with no medical conditions. Phase 2 are also usually quite small trials with low number of participants. But here, the researchers may be looking to see what is the best dosing of a medication. And they may be starting to enroll individuals with a condition that is intended to be treated at this point. Most of the clinical trials you'll hear about, though, are these big trials out in phase 3, some of them randomizing a couple hundred patients, but some of them looking to recruit 8,000, 10,000 patients across the globe. And then phase 4 is when drugs continue to be evaluated long-term. So even though a new compound may have gone through all these phases of study, had a big drug trial, got an FDA approved and be out there in regular clinical practice, the learning doesn't stop at that point. There often need to be longer term studies to understand how the risks and benefits stack up over the decades of using this drug. And this would often involve monitoring of many hundreds or thousands of people to get that information. Now, an important point that is really fundamental to setting up a trial and to a participant's understanding of what's going on is the fact that to conduct a clinical trial and test 2 or more different strategies for diagnosis or for treatment requires that there is some equipoise between those different strategies. That means that there's enough expectation that the different strategies could be equal to make it fair and reasonable to do a trial. So to give an extreme example, nobody's going to set up a trial of jumping out of an aeroplane with a parachute versus jumping out of a plane without a parachute, because clearly there's no equipoise there. We know the only safe way, if one's into jumping out of planes, is to do it with a fully working parachute. So similarly, in a drug trial setting, we would not ever have a trial, and it would never pass regulatory requirements, that randomly assigned participants between a really great treatment that we know is going to work and no treatment, because that wouldn't be right or fair. And so it's always going to be a question where there's some uncertainty about what is the right answer, where maybe the current medication is pretty good, but there's a question about, could this new medication be better? And all that previous phase 1, phase 2 study really sets up a scenario where the researchers can prove there to be expected safety of that compound and a reasonable expectation that adding in that therapy or substituting that therapy for an older established one could be beneficial to patients. Now, I've talked a little bit along the way about regulatory monitoring, and there are many layers of this. So all research studies involving human subjects, even those where the plan of care is not changed, those observational ones that I just described to you, have to be reviewed, approved, and monitored by something called an institutional review board, IRB. And there are institutional review boards at all hospitals. Some have a bigger territory that they oversee. And these IRBs go into great detail in understanding the preliminary data, the scientific premise, the early studies that have been conducted, and make sure that the participants in this proposed study are both receiving the information that they would need to be able to make a good decision about whether trial participation is appropriate for them, but that they're not being subjected to any inappropriate duress, they're not being subjected to inappropriate risks, and that everything is set up to run as safely as possible. Of course, it can never be completely guaranteed that participation in a clinical trial will lead to no harms. And indeed, part of the institutional review board's job is to vet what those harms could potentially be and help the investigators to communicate the risks. Are these very, very rare occurrences, or are these common occurrences? Are these risks of minor inconvenience, such as light nausea, Or could there be risks of death with an intervention? And of course, these are very different scenarios that need to be clearly investigated and interrogated before a study would be approved. Now, anything that's a clinical trial, so changing the plan of care of patients, if it gets to the point of being approved, would also need an independent data and safety monitoring board. So any of these big drug studies or device studies, even some of my much smaller, couple hundred of patient studies, we have to convene an independent group of experts who are monitoring the protocol, the preliminary information as it rolls in, and have certain pre-specified eventualities that they're looking for to be able to either say, wow, the intervention is better than the current status quo. We need to stop the trial because this is a really important therapy and it wouldn't be fair to just keep this in clinical trials for a long time because benefit has been demonstrated. Or thresholds to say, pause, it looks like there's harm here. We have to stop and investigate this bad scenario that has happened. We can't let the trial go on because we're concerned there's harm. The FDA, the Foods and Drugs Administration, of course, plays a very important role in regulating trials, in setting the groundwork, in setting a lot of the expectations around what would need to be demonstrated about a new drug or a new device to be able to lead to its approval. So multiple layers, both at the institution, an independent body, and then up at the FDA that are evaluating, deciding if research can go ahead, and then continually monitoring it during the trial's conduct. So our next question is, why is research important? And I've provided some examples of how we need it to develop treatments. Most drugs, devices, procedures have gone through a clinical trial before their FDA approval or before they're accepted in medical or surgical practice and become available to patients. It's also important to do clinical trials to define which treatments work for which patients. In some settings, it's not true to assume that one treatment is going to work for every group of patients. And sometimes it's very important to construct a trial that studies a known proven medication in a special setting. And special settings are often, for example, children or pregnant patients. They may not be in the first wave of trials because of the slight difference in risks and benefits for those groups. And sometimes it's really important to go and do a clinical trial in a group that could stand to benefit a lot from it, but where it's not been tested. Clinical trials become particularly important for developing treatment options for rare conditions. So these are conditions that are not seen all that commonly and where it's often important to get together larger numbers of patients with that condition from across the country or across the globe to be able to determine if there's an effective treatment. And in the cardiac world, one disease that was considered very rare, but now we look for it more, is TTR amyloidosis, which is a condition of laying down proteins in the heart, for which we now have one approved treatment and several more coming through in clinical trials. And then equally importantly, when a new treatment or a new intervention becomes available, we need to learn more about patient preferences, acceptability, scalability, and this is where we transition into that implementation science as well. Just because a drug performed well in a trial doesn't automatically mean that it's something that's acceptable to patients or that it's something that we can distribute to those who need it. And sometimes we need a clinical trial to figure out the best ways to achieve those goals. I saw this nice quote from a Johns Hopkins medicine research participant advocate about the importance of people volunteering to participate in clinical research. And it's such a necessary partnership to advance care. And that's certainly true of the heart failure world. We're incredibly grateful for participation. And representation really matters. You may be aware that, especially in cardiology, our trials over the past few decades have predominantly recruited white males. And so there are a lot of drugs and devices that we can be very confident work excellently with an acceptable side effect profile in a patient if they're white and male, but that haven't been tested necessarily in women or haven't been tested across race and ethnic groups, where there may be differences in the performance or the safety of that intervention. And you can see here some data from the FDA just about the distribution of these demographics. Older patients as well are often excluded from trials because of uncertainties about risk versus safety. And that's a real shame, because it may be older individuals who stand the most to benefit from a newer therapy. Here are some examples of ongoing heart failure trials that I'm excited to hear the answers on. We have just had one drug trial of a medication called semaglutide report out for patients with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. That's a stiff heart and obesity. There's another one called tirzepatide, the SUMMIT study that's ongoing at the moment, and may be really helpful in understanding how we can aid people who have both obesity and a stiff heart to improve their breathing and improve their future survival. There are some, not so many, but some studies around patients who are either awaiting heart transplantation or have received a heart transplant. For example, there is a study of a therapy called daratumumab for highly sensitized patients, meaning those with a lot of antibodies. And there are some great trials going on about devices. There's a new support device that's about to be studied soon in patients with acute heart failure. And new systems often come out for the treatment of severe valvular disease. There's one being trialed at the moment for leakiness of the tricuspid valve, which is one of the valves on the right side of the heart. Joy had mentioned cardiac sarcoidosis, and one of the studies we're participating in, which is run by the Canadian NIH, is a study of two treatments, one of prednisone alone and one of prednisone with a medication called methotrexate as well, for the treatment of this inflammatory condition called cardiac sarcoidosis, to see what the relative benefits as well as side effects are between those two strategies. That's an example of those two strategies at the moment. Both get widely used. Different doctors in different hospitals would pick to either just do steroids, the prednisone, or to do the steroid plus the methotrexate. And we just don't know which one is the better strategy. So equipoise is present and needs testing. And I mentioned also TTR cardiac amyloidosis, and there are some really exciting new therapies coming down the line for this condition that previous to a few years ago had no treatments, such as the Helios B study of vutrisiran, which is just about to wrap up soon. Now, I'd like to give you a few comments on what should participants expect. If you're participating in a research study, there are a lot of things that you should expect and that you have a right to when you're choosing to hear about a study or even to sign consent. You need to be given adequate time to review the informed consent form, ICF, especially if there's going to be a drug or device intervention involved. You will need time to review that form, talk about things, ask all your questions, and fully understand the risks and benefits. Only by doing that can you come to a decision of whether participating in this study is the right thing for you. So you should never feel rushed into a decision, and it's the responsibility of the research team to make sure that you have time to come to a yes or no decision and that all your questions have been answered. You also have the right to withdraw at any time. Participating in research is totally optional. It's your right to know what are the alternatives to participating in research and to know how would you go about withdrawing and what would be the logistics of that if you wish to do so at any time during participation. You should also expect privacy and confidentiality. Every effort is made to keep your information private and confidential. If the data or the samples are going to be shared outside of the entity that's conducting the research, they must tell you about that and inform you about what protections will be in place. Also, the investigators have a responsibility to inform you about any new updates on relevant information that comes through during the study. So, for example, if a certain side effect or a certain new discovery about a treatment comes through while you're participating in the study, they will have a responsibility to inform you about that. And often they would have to prepare a new consent form to rediscuss the new risks and benefits. Now, we're very cognizant in clinical research that we are asking participants and their family or caregivers for their time, and that time is a very valuable commodity. So it's highly appreciated whenever patients or healthy controls do choose to give of their time to participate in a study. If you think you may have that time and may be interested in participating, there are several places where you could find out about studies and see if there's one in your area that may fit your condition. A very widely used resource is clinicaltrials.gov. This is a US government-based resource on which all trials, especially all of those that involve an intervention, are required to be logged. It's fairly patient-friendly in that there are ways in which you can search in your area for trials that are going on with your condition or a certain drug that you're interested to see if it's being studied anywhere near you. And so this is a great resource, and I'll show you a screenshot. I'll also show you a screenshot of the website of your hospital, and that can be a great place to start too, because usually there'll be some sort of patient-facing resource describing all the trials going on at that center. Now, your doctors, nurses, other hospital staff may well inform you of trials that are about to start up or things that are enrolling, or you may see a flyer or a poster at the hospital. A side note here, if there are handouts or posters being produced about studies, those will have to have been approved by the IRB to make sure they're in keeping with the patient protections that are expected of the study team. Some of you may be familiar with the Heart Failure Society of America, which is a nonprofit society, and you may be aware that they've set up a research network as well. It's just getting off the ground, but this is a way to bring together different institutions and centers caring for people with heart failure across the country, and then have companies that are looking to trial new drugs approach the network and be able to roll out these studies to the patients that may be interested in it. Some trials do advertise through social media and Facebook. So if you see an advert, obviously caution is required, but it may be legitimate because some of the bigger clinical trials now do pay to take out targeted advertising. So the key here is really reading what the trial is. If you can, go and cross-check it with clinicaltrials.gov to make sure it's official and true, but it may give you an easy way to connect in with the clinical trials team and learn about a study that's appropriate to your demographic. And here are a couple of website examples. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you will see that you can put in a condition. Here I put in heart failure as the condition, and it comes up with many thousands of studies. I can further narrow it down to choose studies that are in locations near to me, or ones that are recruiting now versus ones that are coming up soon to get the type of study that I'm looking for. Here's an example of the Tufts Medical Center clinical trials website. I put in heart failure and I saw 13 results for heart failure studies. So that's a useful resource to you as well. And finally, to wrap up here, I do want to come back to how much participation in clinical trials is appreciated. As researchers, we entirely understand that none of these advances could be done without the time and generosity of research participants. And so you'll see that some studies, certainly the ones that I've been fortunate to lead, we try and do a participation appreciation event at the end and tell you a little bit about what were the findings. How did your contributions help us to move medical care forward, and what did we learn? Some studies, especially those that are sponsored by a drug company, will compensate you for your time. So that's something definitely to ask about, whether there's a payment or compensation for participation. And thank you to anybody on this webinar who's participated in one of our studies at Tufts. Much appreciated. These are some of the studies that I'm involved in. Anything from analyzing data about patients with LVADs in the National Registry of People with LVADs, through to some of you may have participated in our body composition study, where we looked at changes in muscle and fat mass over the first 6 months of LVAD implantation and learned some very interesting things about how muscle mass does start recovering after a VAD implant as soon as 3 months after implantation. We're currently developing a technique called skeletal muscle ultrasound to identify patients with muscle wasting, and also have a clinical trial, a small one, open, looking at protein supplementation using Ensure products for patients with heart failure. And should you wish to participate in any of our studies, especially the supplementation study, which is called ASTRID-HF, Abina and Trisha are the two research coordinators that I'm very fortunate to work with, and you could reach out to us either at this number or contact me in the heart failure office at Tufts. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention. We really appreciate having this opportunity to share some information about clinical research with you. And these are my contacts should you need to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vest. That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your extensive knowledge on clinical trials with us this evening. Clinical trials are so important. And speaking for myself, you did a beautiful job at making that information really clear and easy to understand. So thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to open up the floor to any questions that we might have for Dr. Vest. I'd actually like to get started with question. If I'm asked to participate in a research study, who can I ask for advice on whether it's a good fit for me?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're approached about the possibility of participating in a research study, it's always important to seek the input of people whom you know well and who are familiar with your care. So particularly, for example, if you were approached about a research study that looked at something not to do with cardiology, then it would be important to ask your cardiologists or your other cardiac providers, would it be okay for me to participate in this? Would it be safe for me to be a subject in this study? Is there anything that I need to be particularly worried about? Certainly approaching your cardiologist or other heart professionals. You may wish to ask your primary care physician as well, if they have a good sense of your health conditions, because that may be very valuable. You should also feel very free to ask to speak to the doctor who's overseeing the study, as well as the research coordinators. And they will often make themselves very available in person or by phone to talk you through the particular question that is being asked by this study and why they've approached you as somebody who may be an appropriate person to participate, and to start to walk you through the risks and benefits of study participation.
Yeah, it's very important. Excellent. And how are these research studies funded? You know, is it a insurance scenario? Can you give us any insight there?
Right. So that is something that's very important to understand, and this should be outlined in the informed consent form. Usually when there's a clinical trial being conducted, it will have a study sponsor. I use that word a few times. That sponsor could be a drug company who have gone through the many years of developing a new drug, or perhaps a device company. That means that they would be paying for the study. They would be paying not only for the drug or device that's going to be part of the study, but they would also be paying some of the time of the doctors and the research coordinators and maybe research nurses as well, who are going to be conducting the study. They would be paying for the blood tests, the ECG, the echo, whatever the other tests are. And so if this is a study being done for research where the intervention is not something that you'll be getting as part of your routine care, then it would need to be paid for by that research sponsor. Sometimes the sponsor is the National Institutes of Health. So for example, my ASTRID study, I was fortunate to have a grant from the NIH. So our tax dollars go towards that, and the NIH funds for the study. So they're paying for the blood tests, the DEXA scan, which is one of the way we look at muscle mass, for some of my time and Abina and Trisha's time, as well as for the Ensure. In certain studies where it's an observational project, there your care is being conducted as it would if you were in the study or not. And there it may be routine echoes, blood tests that are being paid for by your insurance that are being recorded in the study information. So in that situation, it may be that your care is continuing with the usual channels of payment, but it should not be your insurance that's getting used if something different or extra that is research only is being introduced. You will usually see in the informed consent form very clear language about what is routine clinical care and being paid for in the usual way versus what is just for this research study and therefore being paid in whatever way the study is being funded.
Excellent, excellent. It looks like you did too good of a job, and those are all of our questions for this evening. So again, thank you very, very much for sharing your time and knowledge with us this evening. We really appreciate you. And hey, everybody out there in the audience, I really feel like learning together and being generous with the things that we learn, as exemplified in Dr. Vest's breakdown of who participates in clinical trials and how important it is that we have broader representation. You know, we just become a stronger and stronger community. So thank you for being here. And once that this webinar is uploaded, please feel free to share the recorded version with anybody who might find it helpful. And lastly, before I hand it back to Pat, I wanted to give a big, big thank you to our evening sponsor, Novartis. The HeartBrothers Foundation really appreciates your continued support. And without our generous sponsorships and donations, the HeartBrothers wouldn't be able to support their community like they do. So many thanks to Novartis this evening. And Pat, back to you.
Hello. Can you see me?
Mm-hmm. You're doing great.
I want to thank everybody who joined. Amanda, that was amazing. Joy, you did a great job as usual. It was very informative. I learned a lot, and I just got turned down for trying to do a clinical trial for someone in my age and transplanted and from the pulmonary side. And I know how much it means to help others doing that. It's all part of what we do as HeartBrothers, and I appreciate it. Any of you have the time, try and help all of us in your small way but it's a big way by participating in these. And who knows, maybe you get paid for it. Thank you all again from the HeartBrothers, all of us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next events and our patient support groups for the balance of the year. Have a great night and go have dinner if you haven't already. Thank you.